obviously ask me some questions about ants.
Maybe if I ask some questions that are not about ants.
Yeah.
One of the things you said was that Russian anarchists did not agree with his position on Germany, even like post 1917. But wasn't it generally the Russian anarchist position to oppose the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk once that came about, and also like the position of some SRs and like the left communists?
Yes, yes. Yeah, it was obviously there's two issues. When I was talking about the position during the First World War itself, in terms of like continue the war, defeat Russia, to defend Russia against Germany. And so most Russian anarchists, like most anarchists, there were more Russian anarchists, I would say, in favour of sort of defeating Russia than defeating Germany than elsewhere. But in general, the majority of Russian anarchists, like most of the anarchists around the world, opposed the war as an imperialist conflict. In terms of when it came to the Bolsheviks, after the Bolsheviks seized power, and they started negotiating over sort of how to pull Russia out of the war. Yes, you're right. The anarchists and the left SRs both viewed the Brest-Litovsk peace agreement as a betrayal, and advocated sort of revolutionary war against any German invasion of Russia, revolutionary Russia. Yes. So yes, they opposed that, and the left SRs likewise opposed it. And that was why they left the Bolshevik, the Soviet government in March 1918. And when the Bolsheviks packed the Fifth All-Russian Congress of Soviets and denied the left SRs of their rightful majority, they then assassinated the German ambassador to try to provoke a revolutionary war because they were so opposed to that peace agreement. But yes, so Kropotkin's position, I don't know, because at that stage he was sort of, in the middle of nowhere and sort of really old and not really not taking part of anything. But the anarchists were completely opposed to that peace agreement and argued that it was a betrayal of the revolution.
I have another question, which is one. There's a Bolshevik account of a meeting between Kropotkin and Lennon. Is that? Do we have any reason to believe the accuracy of like? I mean, I guess it's impossible to know the details of what they discussed it or not, but it's an interesting account.
Some of it rings true. The bit it really doesn't ring true when he says, "Oh, Lennon, your book about the state proves I'm wrong, and been wrong since I was like." It's a bit in it when he just basically says like, the state and revolution, like I agree with it completely. I was wrong. And you think he never said that. It's like, but other parts of it, and I know what you're talking about. Some of it does ring true, but the bit it doesn't ring true is when he basically says that Lenin was right about the state, which if you read everything he wrote after all the stuff that was published, in terms of his critique of the Bolsheviks, like his letter to the Western Europe, the workers of the Western world, he never wrote that. He recognised that the Bolshevik state was a dictatorship, a bureaucratic nightmare, and was basically destroying the revolution. So that account is definitely wrong. It's like there's no way he actually said that. As I say, some of what was said kind of rang true, but the key point about the state and how Lenin was right after all was never uttered by Kropotkin. If you read what he wrote afterwards, it just don't match.
Yeah, so I feel like there are certain parts of it that seem obviously, I don't know, imagined or whatever. The one thing that I was actually curious about is, the details of it are now eluding me, but one of the things that was like put forward as a knock against Kropotkin is that like Kropotkin was like more interested in like the cooperative movement in like England or something at the time. I forget exactly what the comment was, but I haven't read that much about Kropotkin being like a hardcore dreamer about the kind of reformist cooperative movement. It seemed a little bit out of character.
Yes, well, he did write about the cooperative movement, and some of his writings, particularly for freedom, he pointed to three movements in Britain which he thought were quite positive. One was the trade unions, one was the cooperatives, and the other one was municipal socialism. But if you read what he actually wrote about cooperatives, he was very clear that they were quite limited, and that in the current state, all they were basically sort of joint stock companies for workers, and they could be just as selfish as capitalist companies. And while cooperatives, he thought, could play a role in the revolutionary movement, like trade unions, they had to be transformed and made better than what they were. So yes, he supported cooperatives as he did support unions, but he was well aware that, you know, reformist cooperatives and reformist trade unions were not insufficient in and of themselves. They had to be revolutionised. And he was well aware that the cooperative movement, like the unions, could play an important role in the revolutionary movement, but only if they were revolutionised. Only if anarchists took part in them and got them to look beyond the narrow self-interest. Yeah, so in a sense, so yes, he supported cooperatives, like he supported unions, but he was critical of them, and he thought that yes, they could play a role, but they had to be transformed and made revolutionary.
The other question I have is not about Kropotkin, but it's about the Russian Social Democrats. I've read the Lil book, and it says something very similar to what you say. Basically, prior to 1905, the prime goal of like Russian Social Democrats is to win freedom of the press, essentially. But is it true that they really did not push for economic reforms post 1905? They didn't push it until like 1917?
Yeah, but basically up until 1917, both the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks viewed the Russian Revolution as basically a bourgeois revolution. The aim was to get a republic at best, or constitutional monarchy, where they could stand for elections and help the development of capitalism. It's only under, and basically in 1905, like Russian workers were saying to Mensheviks and so forth, so you want us to do all this fighting for you, and all we'll get is, you know, a parliament. And they were just, and that's what one group of workers said in 1905, and so they were quite, you know, a bit annoyed that that was how narrow they were trying to do. So in 1917, basically it was a massive change for the Bolshevik Party, and they started to embrace sort of talking about factory committees, expropriating things and so forth. All the stuff the anarchists had been saying before, they took up. But during 1905, the major focus was winning a republic, or winning a constitutional monarchy. And that's because they viewed it as a bourgeois revolution and the stages perspective.
I find that particularly interesting with like the April thesis in 1914. I knew in 1905 they were like pretty far away from it. But that's interesting considering.
Oh yeah, but I mean, like it's like when it was when Lenin came out of all that stuff, a former Bolshevik who was then a Menshevik basically said Lenin's claimed the throne of, which has been empty for 5 decades, the throne of Bakunin, and you know, basically they started advocating policies which were then associated with anarchism, much to the surprise of the Mensheviks and a lot of Bolsheviks actually. But it was very successful. They were definitely well into a winner. They did get support. So,
for some reason, I thought like most of the changes came in 1914.
No, 1917. And the April thesis was April 1917 when Lenin returned to Russia. Between 1914 and 1917, Lenin was writing lots of letters, lots of articles, trying to work out when the Age of Imperialism occurred. The major problem Lenin had in 1914 was that the German Social Democrats could quote Marx and Engels about the need to destroy Russia, and why any war between Russia and Germany would see the Social Democrats supporting Germany. And his major problem was that they were quoting Marx and Engels, and they had to somehow refute that. And so the Bolsheviks spent a lot of time between 1914 and 1917 trying to find a way to say Marx and Engels were right then, but they're wrong now. And they came up with the idea of the Age of Imperialism, which happened almost literally the moment Engels breathed his last. So basically 1896 was like when imperialism happened, the Age of Imperialism, and that was why quoting Marx and Engels wasn't appropriate anymore, because it was a different age. And I won't go into beyond that. But between 1914 and 1917, they were busy basically trying to justify not taking sides in the imperialist war, because the German Social Democrats were quoting Marx and Engels about why you should take sides in wars.
I just realized I've got my dates confused. 1914 is the Menshevik-Bolshevik split, right? Or like the final confrontation, obviously it happens at the Second Congress initially, but the party, that's the final Congress where they're united.
I think it happened
I need to go back.
Yeah, I think it might be 1912, but any other questions?
I was interested in kind of his sort of like advocating like a so-called anarchist party, like in terms of kind of like the legacy that he left kind of after he passed away. Is that kind of like seen in like, you know, the CNT, FAI kind of like sort of ideas of there being kind of like a more syndicalist, like practical kind of like side of the union, but then also having kind of like an anarchist kind of like sort of like platform group, I guess, kind of within the union, in order to protect it from kind of liberal influences of like just falling down kind of like reformist trade unionism. And I was just interested in kind of like, did he have like kind of any ideas of what that anarchist party idea might look like?
He didn't write a lot about it, but he did use. He basically said that you know, he's like unions are important. It's the only way workers can defend their interests without parliamentarianism. But you need something else, which Malatesta talks about, and which Bakunin advocated, practiced. So he was basically viewing it as basically Malatesta wrote more about it, the Italian anarchist. So he presumably agreed more or less with what Malatesta was writing, and he also agreed with the alliance idea of Bakunin. But he didn't write a lot about it. If you read Caroline Camm's book, she goes into sort of his attempts to build a sort of close network of anarchists within the Jura Federation and within the Federalist wing of the International. And I think when he arrives in Britain, he does. That's not the forefront of his argument. His forefront of the arguments he was going through was like sort of talking about expropriation, revolution. Getting anarchists to go to the people, take part in labour movements and so forth. But he didn't spend a lot of time talking about how the anarchists should organise. I think he was sort of basically, as long as you do get organised and as long as you do take part in popular movements, that what works out most. So if you're looking for, so basically I think he left Malatesta to do most of the heavy lifting in terms of what sort of how anarchists should organise. But yes, he definitely thought that anarchists should organise as anarchists to influence the class struggle. How best to do that? I think it was a case of he didn't think that one size fitted all. It was a case of you'd have to work it out in your local circumstances. But he clearly recognised the need for anarchists to get involved and influence struggles.
And so before I go, can you tell us what was happening to the ants?
Oh yes, yeah, it's a really good program. It's probably an iPlayer, but yes, the Jura Federation. Yeah, Jura. So basically, according to sort of the selfish gene notion of evolutionary biology, they explain sort of ant cooperation based on they're all clones, so they're all genetically identical. Hence, they will work together against other colonies. But in the Jura, in France, they've got groups of ant colonies which are genetically unrelated are working together and basically cooperating. And this apparently breaks the laws of evolution. So maybe your laws of evolution are wrong, but anyway. But it was like, so basically, this is causing a puzzle for all these like selfish gene people, because like this shouldn't happen. And it's just like, but it's like David Attenborough's doing the documentary, and basically the life of the colonies which are not which are fighting against each other. Basically, the ants get up, they go out, they fight, they die, they get their insides liquefied, and they get all the juices sucked out of them. And it's like not a very nice life. But the ants which are working together, which are actually the different colonies who actually work together, they get up, they go get something to eat, go get something else to eat, come back, and have quite a nice life. And it's like, and these so-called scientists are going like, this is a puzzle. It's like, well, I think I know why the ants are doing it, because it's like, life's a lot easier when you're not getting your insides liquefied and sucked out of you. It's like, so, but it's on iPlayer, and it's and I would recommend watching it. It's really good, and it's basically showing you that cooperation between genetically different ant colonies happens, and is beneficial to the ants involved, because they're having a nice life and they're not getting fighting all the time and getting their insides liquefied and sucked out. And so it makes a lot of sense for the ants. And the fact that by sort of bourgeois evolutionary theory is having a problem with this just shows you how narrow-minded it is, because it's obvious why they're doing it, because cooperation works. And so, yeah, it's as I say, the program's about 3 or 4 years old. It's probably an iPlayer, but the Jura ant colonies are all working together based on different genetics, different genetic queens, and it's because their life, basically, as Kropotkin argued, cooperation means that you have a better chance of survival, and you have more offspring, and you have a better life, and the Jura ants prove it. And and according to some evolutionary theorists, this should never have happened, because it's breaking the laws of evolution, which shows you that mainstream evolutionary theory is limited.
In defense of mainstream evolutionary theory, the selfish gene is not undebated.
Oh, no, yeah. I mean, but
Bourgeois scientists agree.
yes, but if you read the second edition of The Selfish Gene has the end chapter is called "Good Guys Finish Last." No, "Good Guys Finish First," and it talks about reciprocal altruism, which is basically mutual aid, and basically Dawkins admits through gritty teeth that cooperation is actually works as an evolutionary strategy, and it is well established. But if you're interested in a good person who goes into sort of this whole theory, Franz de Waal, the primatologist, read some of his books about sort of critiquing the selfish gene, we're all selfish idea, and he knows about Kropotkin and he puts it well. But Dawkins, as I say, through gritty teeth in the second edition of The Selfish Gene, does admit that cooperation does work. But he never seems to take it on board. He always seems to sort of have caveats about it, and misfiring genes and so forth. It's like, you just can't admit it. And it's very frustrating, because as a good Darwinian, you should know that Darwin he wrote about cooperation and its benefits. And it's nothing, and cooperation is not remotely non-Darwinian. It's like, but he is very much a product of his culture. Mm-hmm. Any more questions?
What do you think the biggest takeaways are from Kropotkin's life for anarchists, or anybody that wants to change the world today?
The importance of grounding your politics in an understanding of the world around you, and getting involved in social struggles. That's the two key things. He points to the tendencies, the importance to understand the tendencies which are going on, things which point to a better future, and the importance of getting involved in pushing that better future and making it happen. I would say those are the two key things. His overall aim was to create a synthetic philosophy which could sort of basically explains lots, sort of explain everything basically, and try to get sort of understanding history, understanding biology, and basically applying a scientific principle to revolutionary politics, and that includes as part of the class struggle and social movements. So I would say that was it.
Did he ever do a tour of Scotland? I'm trying to remember. He met in a Lanarkshire mine.
Yes, he did do regular tours all around Britain. The first place he landed when he escaped from prison was Scotland, and he came up regularly to, as it said in Freedom at the time, to meet the Scotch. And yes, he had friends and comrades in both Edinburgh and Glasgow, and he spoke in both. Yeah, and elsewhere. I think he also did Edinburgh. His health wasn't the greatest because of the unsanitary conditions within the Peter and Paul prison. But that meant he couldn't do quite as much as he could do. But he did do regular tours, and that included Scotland.
That was up till when?
Up until about turn of the century, 1900. After that, it became fewer and fewer. And sometimes he would just people would read out letters from Kropotkin. During the 1905 revolution, he wasn't well enough to actually come and speak at events, so people would read out letters on his behalf. And he would try to participate in, I think he went to Durham for the Miners' Gala and so forth. And he also took part in demonstrations in London and elsewhere, gave talks in Glasgow, Edinburgh. But his health started to really take a toll about 1900 onwards, and then he sort of became less active. Yeah, did the whole tour. He was very famous. He was sort of if you do look at sort of old newspapers, he's when I was doing some research for what was I doing? Was it for anarchism? We did it. Black Flag did a Kropotkin special last year, and there's letters about Kropotkin from Kropotkin, about articles about Kropotkin in the Australian press. It would be Prince Kropotkin's done this, Prince Kropotkin's done that. He was an international celebrity because obviously he was a Russian prince who became an anarchist, and they reported on his opinions and what he was going up to and stuff all around the world. You'd find it in workers' papers, but you'd also find it in the mainstream bourgeois media talking about him and his opinions on what was going on in Russia, as well as Kropotkin's views on trade unionism and stuff. They would appear in places you wouldn't expect.
I also have a question about his prince status. He eventually, either he renounced his inheritance or it was, kept from him, and also he renounced his, title as a prince.
Oh yeah, that.
When did that happen?
It happened when he was a teenager. He was very influenced by the French revolutionary tradition. His tutor when he was at secondary school, essentially, when his teenage years, was a French Republican, and so he had become completely opposed to the monarchy and aristocracy by teenage years, and he refused to, and he renounced his title then. But I mean that didn't stop the media here calling him Prince all the time. It's but he refused to. He basically rejected it at a really early age, long before he became an anarchist. So we were talking teenage years, 16, something like that.
So was he already not on speaking terms with his family as a teenager?
Well, no, I think his mother died at an early age, and basically he was off. He went to military academy, so he wasn't living with his parents his father anymore. So he was out of the house, and so he was sort of so he basically rejected all that. When he went into exile, he refused to get his inheritance. So basically, the serfs were freed. Any sort of land owning he had, he never claimed it. So maybe somebody else in the family took it. So he completely severed all ties with his aristocratic background. And the only thing, obviously he had the best education his father's serfs could provide in terms of exploiting their labour, but there's nothing he could do about that. But everything else, he renounced his title, he renounced his land holdings, he renounced everything. And he just basically stayed. When he was in exile, he basically worked for a living. He wrote scientific papers. He wrote for the 19th Century, a leading liberal journal. He obviously wrote stuff for the Anarchist Press and wrote books and so forth. But his major income was writing scientific articles for scientific journals and for reviews like the 19th century. And he considered that an anarchist or socialist, he says he was socialist, had to earn his own living, and he did. So he worked as an intellectual worker, and he made his living by basically, as I say, writing scientific things. He wrote the column Recent Science in the 19th century, and he did get paid for the work for anything he did get published in the 19th century and in other journals. But that was his income, as he earned his income as a writer. And he thought it was right, but he thought it was right for socialists to earn their living, and he did, which I agree with, actually. It's a case of I've got my job and that pays for everything else I do, and never consider charging anything for the movement. You do what you do.
To what extent is it going to be true to say that Kropotkin's before the fact critique of Marxist state socialism was based on his interpretation of the Jacobin State?
Yes, he said there was a link. If you read Modern Science and Anarchy, he did basically say that the Jacobin State, which had been created to crush the popular movements of the time, was the vision which had been inherited by the Marxists, via various French revolutionaries, sort of Blanquists and so forth, and coming out of that area, and Marx and Engels talked about the need for one indivisible republic all the time. So they were influenced by the Jacobins, and he said yes, basically. The notion of a centralised Jacobin state was something which the Marxists have taken over and linked to socialism, even though it was created to destroy the popular movements and aspirations of the Great French Revolution. But yes.
Another question. Kropotkin at one point in his life was a member of a circle with a bunch of other Russian radicals.
Yes.
One of which became a leading left SR, if I recall correctly. I was just wondering, were there any... it seems like a lot of the people that came out of that world didn't end up becoming anarchists, and I was curious if he continued having fraternal relationships. I forget what the name was.
Yeah, yes, he became a SR, social revolutionary, and he had lots of close contacts with the Social Revolutionary Party in exile. And he did, because he was like a populist as well, and so he did have very close links with the VSRs. They only split in 1917, so we're talking just the social revolutionaries in exile. And when there was a big, basically somebody was accused of being a police spy, and Kropotkin, this is like 1909, 1908, something like that, and Kropotkin led the investigation to see if it was true or not, because he was respected by all the sides in the social revolutionary movement and the Social Revolutionary Party, and quite a few, yes, and so he was very well respected within Russian populist Russian political circles, and in terms of, and there was quite an overlap between the left in terms of politics. The left SRs and the anarchists had quite an overlap in terms of politics. We were both federalists, both decentralists, both aiming to give land to the peasants. And so forth. There was an overlap there. Voline, who wrote The Unknown Revolution, he was initially a social revolutionary before he became an anarchist in exile. So there were very close links, and Kropotkin was very well respected within SR circles.
And the other question I had, especially in that early phase when there was like more of a close relationship between like neurodniks and anarchists and Marxists, I was curious, did his hostile view to Marxists develop during that period? Because I think there were some later members of the Russian Social Democratic Party in that circle. I don't know if I remember correctly. And then of course Marx had correspondence with, I think, with some neurodniks as well as and there's obviously relations with Zasulich, I think, and neurodniks and whatnot. At what point did he get his opinions about the Russian Social Democrats?
Well, I think his opinions on Marxism came about from his own experiences within the Western European labour movement. Initially in Switzerland, where he saw what was going on with the official Marx-backed IWA branch in Geneva, and that sort of set his opinions. And he also saw what was going on with the rise in German social democracy, and how they were basically stressing parliamentarianism, downplaying unions and downplaying any sort of revolt. And so that's where his negative views of Marxism came in, because he saw what we were doing to the labour movement in France and in Germany and so forth. In terms of Russia, the Russian they were basically, they were all trying to follow the example of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And so I don't think he had anything specifically, when he was talking about the Social Democrats during the 1905 revolution and so forth, it was nothing specifically about the Russian movement as such. It's basically they're copying the Germans are making a mistake by going down the parliamentary route, and it's just a general critique. So in terms of the Russian movement, I think he only really came face to face with it when he was in Russia and saw what was going on under the Bolshevik regime, which was confirming what he predicted was going to happen based on what was going on in the German and Western European socialist movement, with the domination of social democracy.
What was his, like, I don't really know what this sort of, what people knew about like environmentalism and stuff like that back then, but obviously he was a man of science and studied animals to an extent. So what would have been his views on that, and did he write a lot around that sort of thing?
He wrote, it's his most famous work in terms of sort of talking about the impact of industry is fields, factories and workshops. And that is a sort of talking about the importance of integrating industry and agriculture, talking about getting a balance right between sort of how we live and how we work with nature. He is mostly to do with he's not as I think Elise Reclus is probably more ecologically minded at the time than him, but there's definitely awareness of the importance of getting a balance in your natural environment, making sure that that you're living in harmony and in integration with the local surroundings. So fields, factory and workshops is definitely sort of that small is beautiful, but without being dogmatic about it. I mean, as I say, it's appropriate levels of technology, but he was very aware of the importance of human scale, and obviously if you're talking about integrating workplaces and fields, you're obviously thinking about the impact that has on the environment, because you're living there and you don't want to be in a situation where you're pumping out rubbish everywhere. So I would say that he was more a sort of a proto-green rather than a sort of strong advocate. But if you read people like, his ideas definitely influenced Murray Bookchin, and definitely there's definite influence like Small is Beautiful, and he's definitely one of the writers who sort of anticipated a lot of the more explicitly green material that came about after the Second World War. But yes, he is. I would consider him as a green writer, but that wasn't his focus. Yeah, but he definitely advocated ideas which Greens have championed since.
I actually have the slides.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks.
The Anarchist FAQ, wonderful seeing you / interviewing you person.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I'm glad you like it.
Thank you.
So if there's no more questions, then I'm going to head home because I've had a long day. Thanks very much for coming.
Yeah, thanks very
Hope
much.
you enjoyed it.
Thank you.